to doing that. But we also know, and it was in the news again today, that the existing mayors are hungry for more powers. They are not prepared to stand still. They want more powers to do more things over their areas. And I suppose the kind of question for us then is, how do we think about the agenda that's emerging? Where would we want to see emphasis and prioritization? Can everything be done all at the same time? So that's really what we're going to do. And we're going to try and do it in two parts. And we've got a fantastic panel to explore these issues. We've got Jack Shaw, who's a senior advisor at Labour Together, Claire Spencer, head of policy and programmes around devolution at the Future Governance Forum, and Anne Bridge, my colleague at the Centre for City, leads on our devolution and planning work. So that's our panel. Our agenda, our remit is to talk through some of these issues. And I say we're going to do that in two parts. Part one, really just a summary, a review of where we've got to. And then part two, I think, is how much of what we've seen so far do we want to roll on? How much do we want to change? In what ways do we want to change it? Or with a view of obviously trying to talk to the government about how it evolves, and finally, and that there'll be a devolution white paper in the not too distant future. We'll set out some of these kind of thoughts. So, Jack, you kick us off. You start us off with a sort of a review of where we are, where we've been, I think, over the last decade or so, some of the key attributes, characteristics that you've highlighted during that period.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and good to join you in Centre for Cities. You've been doing lots of good work in this space. In terms of where we are, I think there's now a kind of broad consensus with this particular form of devolution. So with combined authorities largely led by mayors. Prior to at least 2010, there was a much more kind of lively debate about the merits of regionalism versus city regions, for example, which this approach now departs from, with New Labour at the time kind of particularly favouring that regional approach, and we saw that kind of come to an end to some degree in 2004 with the ill-fated North East referendum. Those debates seem to be kind of broadly settled, and as a result, there's a kind of shared understanding across the political spectrum. If I was to kind of pick out a couple of characteristics, which I think has comprised the last decade or so, I would draw on first the kind of centrally led deal-making process, although my sense is that maybe in the last couple of years at least, that's moving a little bit more in the direction of mayors with more agency into a kind of deal shaping process rather than a deal making process. Second is that we're still in this kind of fragmented space where English devolution has evolved in a kind of uncoordinated way, disconnected from much of the wider policy making landscape and broader strategy and long-term vision. Third, I think, is this prioritisation around governance arrangements that favour mayors, and that's been favoured both by Conservatives and Labour. And fourth, I think, where combined authorities have been created, they've tended to coalesce around a small number of thematic priorities, so particularly skills, transport and housing. So I think that's a kind of good example of some of the characteristics that have begun to emerge over the last decade.
Brilliant. We'll pick up characteristics and then we'll come around and do a second, your sort of pros and cons of the approach thus far, I think, because then that leads naturally and nicely into part two. So Claire, come in on this now, in terms of what Jack's been talking about, sort of some of those attributes. What would you add in to how we could think about where we've got to and where we are now?
Yeah, so I'll start on because one thing that I find quite charming about combined authorities is that they operate in a really complex authorizing environment, and you tend to find that the politicians and the officers within those authorizing environments take different views on how important the different bits are. So the first part is combined authorities are made from local government, right? Combined authorities cannot exist without local government bringing them together. So that accountability back down to the local tier is incredibly important. And when you have poor relationships within combined authorities, you feel that fragmentation there the most starkly, I would say. But of course, having a directly elected mayor you are almost also a sovereign body, a separate organisation that is held accountable through that directly elected position. And in the governance of the CA, the mayor is the only person elected in that way. That also kind of creates its own kind of issues and tensions when you blend those things together. And then finally, and this is kind of thinking about what George Osborne and Michael Heseltine envisaged devolution as being about, you very much have this, oh, wouldn't it just be easier to speak to fewer people, which is kind of how they saw it, really. So isn't it much better to be able to pick up the phone to Andy Street rather than to speak to Albert Bohr in Birmingham? So I think there is this kind of all things at once, and there will be some people who think that link to government is the most important thing about this devolution agenda, others that think it's that mayoral space, and others that think it's the local. But the reality, I think, is that working in that kind of devolutionary way has had to be all three of those kind of dancing at the same time. And I think the most successful combined authorities, and we can kind of point to which we think those are in different ways, I think are the ones who manage to do that dance the most nimbly. So I think that's really important. I would say, though, that the way that government has treated combined authorities in this phase of devolution has been, it has affected how they've been able to form. So if you kind of fund things kind of separately through projects, through limited pots of money, you make it really hard to create a sort of corporate centre that is kind of strong and brainy and full of capability, because you have to go, oh, well, here are the people who are working on commissioning the adult education budget, and they're on fixed term contracts because X, Y, and Z. Here are the people who are funded through transport levies, so this is why they do the X, Y, and Z. Here are the people, da-di-da-di-da. So you end up in a sort of situation where combined authorities become quite a lot better at being effective recipients and distributors of project monies, rather than actually being able to think expansively and strategically and interestingly in the way that Jack has just kind of outlined. I think quite often about our friends at Open Innovations, famous fun internet troll Tom Forth and the like, when he kind of always says what he tells people is to fund teams and not functions. And I think that this is a really kind of key learning point for combined authorities. Like, I think funding the capability and not the function is something that I hope is about to be learned as we move into the next stage of devolution. And I think finally, and just to pick up on the sort of deal making point that Jack has made, I think there definitely has been a level of greater empowerment and an ability to influence from some of the mayors. But I do think the deal making has been a sort of fundamentally lopsided feature of devolution, because government is never going to give what it doesn't wish to give. So it's kind of a bit of a cipher of negotiation. And having been in the West Midlands Combined Authority when we were negotiating the Trailblazer, I cannot even begin to tell you how much industry goes into kind of that deal negotiation, when in reality it's no negotiation at all. So if you were saying to DFE, oh, well, if you don't give us what we want on 16 to 19, we're not going to deliver your housing numbers, DFE are going to go, oh, don't give a shit. Like they do not. These things are not interdependent with each other. So you are not negotiating with the government. You are negotiating on a not only department by department, but team by team basis. And it is just such a monumental waste of time, when actually, obviously, what I think everybody is now talking about in a really helpful way is, let's talk more expansively about what should be done locally, what should be done sub-regionally, what should be done regionally, and let's think about what it looks like to get there. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
Brilliant, fantastic, and great insights from being involved in the negotiations and conversations as well. And round us off on the review of where we've got to and some of the characteristics of that process and that time.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I don't have an enormous amount to add. I think Jack and Claire have just provided an excellent summary of where we are. I mean, it's just two things that kind of really jump out to me, I think, that are important about where we've got to. Is obviously, we've had the metro mayors established and the combined authorities, primarily in the big cities. Those are really based around economic geography. So economic geography has been a really core principle of devolution. up until that point, and you've had these places like West Midlands, Greater Manchester have developed their capacity over over the period of devolution, making use of that new system and new framework. I'm going deep with the trailblazers, as Claire just mentioned. But I think there's also been this kind of parallel process lurking in the background that hasn't quite had as much glamour as devolution and mayors has attracted, which has been this steady unitarisation of the counties. So we're now in a position where pretty much the entire north of England, apart from Lancashire, is unitarised. We've got kind of quite big unitaries down in the south of England as well, large counties like Cornwall and Somerset, as well as also kind of the small urban unitaries that existed since the 1990s. So, devolution to the metro mayors has primarily been based upon unitaries. So this is kind of an important step on the devolution journey across England, but it also kind of raises kind of difficult questions about the role of district councils in shire counties and what their role is in the future of devolution local government going forwards.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And Jack and I were just talking before we came on air as to whether how soon it would be that Ant would start talking about local government reform when it was less than a couple of minutes. So I don't know who had the bet, Jack, but maybe both of us won. But it makes a good point around I think particularly how this influences what we do going forward. Jack, come back to you because Claire started to do this and then started touching it as well. But just say a little bit about you described the process and some of the themes and the characteristics. When you think about the period that we've gone through, the big pluses and I suppose the big minuses of that approach, because then that'll influence what we think ought to be rolled forward or stuff that should be stopped or whatever it might be. Jack, just your takeaways on that.
Yeah, so I think there are probably more cons in many ways than pros, but one that probably fluctuates between them both is that devolution's been really iterative. We have no federalised system or constitutional framework to draw on, and that's been quite helpful in helping devolution evolve over time, and it's been able to kind of tack itself onto a whole host of political projects from levelling up to the Northern Powerhouse and so on. But there are quite a few gaps, and what that's also meant is that there isn't a very clear kind of strategic rationale for devolution, or at least that flexibility is also in some ways its weakness. So we see the current government, which sees combined authorities as a kind of important vehicle for achieving its missions around growth, not their sole function, but an important one. The previous administration put them at the centre of levelling up, and that kind of lack of clarity of purpose, I think, or lack of transparency around how devolution deals are made, and referenced functional economic geographies. There are kind of two indicators that are often taken into account: functional economic geographies and identities. Sometimes those are in tension and we don't actually have a framework for resolving them. So I think that's a good manifestation of the absence of the kind of strategic environment for devolution. And that's a kind of a real challenge. Addressing that is essential to realising the opportunities that I think devolution offers.
Yeah.
And then I'd just make a reflection on the kind of more immediate environment around deal making, and one of the cons when it comes to that. We're getting to a position, as you mentioned in your introduction, where we are kind of filling the map, as it were, quite quickly now. But what that will end up doing is kind of creating, I suspect, a kind of series of perverse outcomes. One of those is what I call liminal spaces. So you've got Telford and Wrekin, for example, to its north, south and west. It's surrounded by Shropshire, which has decided not to pursue devolution, instead work in partnership with local authorities across the Welsh border. To its east is Staffordshire and Stoke, which is pursuing, at least according to the latest expressions of interest that they've been submitting, pursuing its own devolution deal. And so you kind of end up in this state where you've got places like that, and certainly Telford and Wrekin's not the only one, where they don't really have any options for devolution. The likelihood is that some of these places will end up joining existing combined authorities around them. But we see the same in Cumbria. It felt it was kind of too small to go it alone, but Lancashire to its south is already going it alone, so it doesn't have an option there. So I think that's a kind of a big risk to the current approach as well.
We'll definitely come back to that. I mean, and it gets to the heart of, I think, the approach as to whether, government should be playing more of a strategic sort of oversight role in terms of, being more deliberative about what it wants to see happen and literally where it wants to see it happen. And we'll come on to that in a second. I just wonder, we get Claire's thought on this as well. Notwithstanding the, whatever the circumstances, a fair amount has been achieved over the last decade. I wonder what's your thought on, the deal-based approach, for all its limitations, and maybe we're bumping up against more of them now, was the reason, or not the reason, but a significant reason as to why we were able to make progress in a fairly rapid fashion, because we didn't go for this kind of big, all at once, everywhere, kind of big bang approach. It was very much, picking places off, coalition of the willing, trying to do something around some of our big Midlands and city, northern city regions. Do you buy that in terms of, that's allowed us to get to where we've got to?
Yeah, I do buy that. And I think, as I was kind of alluding to, that's both a strength and a weakness. The incrementalism enabled us to make some progress, but at the risk of not a broader strategic vision. I think we're at a different point now where if we were to say, let's look at the progress we've made in the last decade, let's look at a decade ahead, and would we be happy with a similar amount of progress? We'd probably broadly say, that's not acceptable. We need to move a little bit faster and into kind of deeper domains when it comes to devolution around local investment levers, and kind of embedding mayors in the broader decision-making framework and so on across English governance. So I think that's definitely helped, but I think we're getting to a point where, and I'm not kind of wedded to this, but we should certainly question whether or not the deal-making process is kind of beginning to pass its shelf life.
Yeah. Claire, come in. I mean, you already in your sort of opening comments saying a little bit about, the goods and the bads. Just add, round that out a little bit more in terms of, when you think about where we've got to, goods and bads of that approach.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, I am ruthlessly pragmatic about how you make progress on these things. And there is just no doubt that we have made an extraordinary amount of progress through the kind of, even what I think is a completely made up deal making process that is largely performed to everybody's mutual satisfaction. Nonetheless, we have formed combined authorities. We have seen how they develop in different ways. We can see how much the individual leadership of the mayor and their leaders really changes the sort of tenor and complexion of all of those different CAs. And I'm really fine with us seeing how that works with a few willing places before considering how that ought to be kind of rolled out and standardized. And so I'm not too worried about that, really. I think where we're getting to now, and I think colleagues who work in adult skills commissioning would talk about this really well, that when you're looking at the parts of those devolution deals that concern those AEB budgets, they're not kind of proportionally quite right. Like, you have to give places a little more in order for them to be able to establish those functions and those partnerships in the way. And that, I think, that is good and proper. But it does create a problem when you get towards the end of that cycle, when you know that what you've got left to distribute is not going to be enough to kind of go around in that way. I think AEB is a really kind of clear place where that has happened. Actually, if you looked at academisation, which as a devolutionary I am vehemently opposed to as a kind of principle, but nonetheless exactly the same thing happened there. The DFE was able to incentivise massively those early adopters of academised schooling in a way that absolutely does not happen now when a school converts to an academy. So I think there is just this, not only do we need to move to something different now, even though deal making had a certain utility, there are actual kind of boundaried examples of where we now have to think very differently about how we kind of bring those kind of funding pots together and or to expand them or whatever. And I suspect we'll go on to talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, brilliant. And just pros and cons of the approach in addition to what Jack and Claire already said.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think we can broadly say politically that this devolution deal approach for small unitaries in the city regions has worked. I mean, certainly compared to kind of the regional approach under the previous Labour government. The debate, as Jack said, seems to be settled. There's now a consensus that this is the right approach. I think that isn't just within our domain either. That's really helped put cities at the centre of the national economic debate, and it's helped put regional inequalities at the centre of political debate across the country, right? So there's quite a clear link, I think, between these sort of semi-constitutional changes and the nature of a national debate. Is a very important pro that's come from the devolution process. I think also this kind of sort of slow unitarization has been important. We've achieved some quite big changes without scaring the horses, as it were. But certainly in terms of the cons, I think we've sort of discussed this a little bit already. But we now have quite severe inconsistencies between places in terms of what they can do and what they can't do, and that's obviously a feature. But I think it's also increasingly becoming a bug over time. And I think now that pretty much all the places where you used to have these collections of quite small neighbouring urban unitary authorities that often used to have a metropolitan county council kind of in charge of that strategic stuff. Now a lot of that stuff has been done, and we've got an established model for devolution to those areas. I think we're sort of running out of easy fruit to pick, and extending that kind of combined authority metro mayor model outside of the big cities to places that have quite a different structure of economy, quite a different structure of geography, quite a different structure of local government, I think is increasingly becoming a problem, as we might get onto.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Okay, let's move to where we think it is. And I should have said right at the beginning, the colleagues that are on the call, listening and watching, as always, you can put questions or comments, criticisms, queries, observations, whatever you want to call them, into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will throw them in as appropriate. And there's no prize, but we expect very early reference to Redcliffe Mode. Otherwise, the people on the call are not doing their civic duty. So I look forward to we've had two, but two before I've just said this. So I expect the third question to in somehow reference Redcliffe Mode, which I look forward to. Let's move to where we think. So we'll talk about a little bit about what Labour should do and the new government should do. And there's loads of nuance and difference and variation, but very simplistically, and probably too simplistically, we can say, at the moment at least, white paper soon to be, that the Labour government are committed to devolution. They've made various statements pre-election, post-election around that. There seems to be a commitment within that, particularly, but not exclusively, to widen devolution to the places that haven't currently got anything. So that's the sort of missing 50% or filling in the map element. There's definitely a sort of commitment to that. But they want to do that, it seems, at least through a sort of still an incremental sort of approach, coalition of the willing approach that you've all touched on, but they have provided some loose framework around what they would expect the guidelines or the parameters that the coalitions of willing would be using. And then there are different stages or levels that different places can go for, depending on how ambitious or whatever they are, through 1s to 5, etc. That's a very crude, overly simplistic overview. Am I missing anything fundamental from what we've heard so far? Jack, we'll do a quick round on if there's anything we want to fundamentally throw in, and then I'll get each of you to say something about what you think about that approach. But Jack, do you broadly concur with that, or is there something I've missed on?
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. I think because there is a shared diagnosis around the challenge, the Conservatives and Labour have landed in a similar place. I think what Labour might be doing is kind of putting on steroids what has come before it. I think there's probably two observations that I'd make that feel quite distinct over the last couple of months. That the first is that tonal shift, and it feels to be kind of quite symbolic. The previous administration was in spats with local authorities quite frequently, and as well as combined authorities. Labour has been really clear about the importance of a partnership approach. We saw mayors go into Downing Street very visibly in the first week of the Labour government. The number 10 operation, I think, is a bit more beefed up when it comes to devolution. So that's a kind of signal or statement of intent that I think is really important in the context of a very low trust environment between the centre and local and sub-regional government. The second shift, and I don't think we've kind of quite appreciated how fundamental that shift could be yet, because it's only being realised, is in the creation of the Council of Nations and Regions, and in the prospect of this kind of idea around a kind of devolution first principle, where places might say, I'm interested in this power or this strategic role, and the government is kind of accountable for that. I think there's a kind of real important mindset shift there at that level, but also a kind of codification of the role of mayors. If you look at local authorities, they already feed in to the policy-making process through organisations like the Local Government Association, which is well established, but through other mechanisms as well. Mayors have really kind of done so on an informal basis. And you will hear some of them say, Andy Burnham does very well because he was in government and he knows the people that are now in government. So I think that's quite important and worth reflecting on as well. There will obviously be legitimate questions around whether or not that institutional architecture has the kind of teeth or it's the right setup or so on, but that we're moving in that direction, I think, is really positive.
Yeah, that's a great point. Claire, what would you add in terms of, the sort of overly simplistic sort of description I had of where I think Labour are?
It was a summary. It was not overly simplistic. Do not do yourself down. So what I would kind of say is that, so I agree with Jack in that I think the kind of diagnosis, and I think the Gordon Brown Commission did this in kind of beautiful, expansive detail. I think not only did it show that it's not just that devolution is a nice to have for a load of positive outcomes, including economic growth. It is actively the reason why we have been failing as a kind of country and a set of nations in all the ways that we have been. And I think what's been really interesting to me, and I suppose I'm not surprised necessarily, but Labour has kept devolution very much tethered to the economic growth mission and part of the narrative, and perhaps not more expansively connected to that kind of decade of renewal piece, which I consider as being something rather broader. And when I think about the kind of what it is as a citizen who feels that the state is completely indifferent to you, your life, the kind of opportunities you have while a kind of chaotic world swirls around you, it feels to me like there's more politics that could happen to kind of create that really sort of fertile space for this and I'm sure this agenda is very heartfelt to Labour. I don't think they're just putting it on. But I think there's a lack of politics in that kind of broader space that needs to be filled a little bit. I also think that they are coming up against kind of cold reality. And I know a number of people, including Sam Friedman, who's done the recent reports for Labour Together, who've observed how hard it would be to come into government from opposition and make the adjustment between being, a team, an opposition team who sees each other quite a lot and does a lot of shared thinking and strategizing together, to a team that is dismembered across different bits of Westminster, Whitehall, and now that Angela Rayner has a Manchester office, even the country. Now, I think that's a very positive thing, but there's no doubt, so I'll give you an absurd example. So today, the mayors will be going to Newcastle for the Council of Mayors. They will then tomorrow be going to Edinburgh for the Council of Nations and Regions. Today's meeting is an hour. Tomorrow's meeting is an hour and a half. And that was called probably with 10 days notice, if that. That's not acceptable, right? Like, I will absolutely take it as we're learning how things work. This is teething. This is getting things going. Totally fine. But I think there is now this kind of real risk moment for Labour that all the things they really do want to do are going to be tested through the reality of how government does and doesn't work. And I want to be really kind of clear on because it's often in the sort of devolution land that it sounds like I'm kind of a sort of central government hostile person. I'm really not. Like, this is just let's respect and honour what these different tiers of government are for, right? Like, I used to hate it as a councillor, where if I gave an answer that a resident didn't like, they'd go, oh, well, I'll go and tell on you to Roger Godsiff. And it's like, well, I don't care. Like, you know, you're my boss, not him. Like, there's nothing more scary than you shouting at me, President, because you are where my power comes from, just as you are where his power comes from, right? But there is this kind of weird thing in people's heads that they think if you've got a low tier, it means that the tier above is your boss. And it's not that. It's just that we organize our state at different levels in order to enable different types of collective activity in a way that benefits us the most, right? And so I think that this is all about not only kind of local, sub-regional, neighborhood level activity finding its best and most robust form, but also about central government being sort of liberated to work in a way that this Labour government is clearly really keen that it does, notably through some of the kind of mission-driven government piece. And you've seen that some bits of the Labour government, including kind of Ed Miliband's part, have got going a little bit quicker on that. But again, I think that's something that's very sincerely meant and is very material to this devolution agenda.
Brilliant. And let's come to you. Let's take what we've heard, what we've discussed, and now begin to say a little bit about, you know, what we would ideally want to be, or what we would be saying to government to think about how it takes forward the devolution agenda. We've got snippets of what we think are going to happen. Claire and Jack have laid out aspects of it. We've discussed those already. But when we think about, you know, where the agenda is and what the government is committed to doing in various ways, you know, what do we think they need to focus their attention on? You kick us off, and then I'll get Claire and Jack to come in on that. You know, in a sense, we kind of know where they are. What do we encourage them to do more of, to do slightly less of? And you kick us off.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think, you know, as Jack alluded to there, I think we are starting to see from some of the expressions of interest from councils coming forward with devolution, a very complex map starting to provisionally appear in terms of devolution. We already have a very complicated map of local government right now in England. I think there is possibly a risk that if the kind of current approach is continued, we end up kind of accidentally making the system even more complex and more difficult to navigate than the system that we currently have, which has all kinds of implications for you know, management of local economies, delivering economic growth, holding bodies accountable, you know, public service reform. I think all become much more challenging if you've got that kind of more complicated setup. So I think, you know, we've been sort of thinking about this. I think there's kind of four kind of key principles that the government should be thinking about, at least in terms of, you know, taking devolution forward, responding to these proposals, and thinking about, you know, what does their ideal end destination look like. I think number one is thinking about, well, how do we make devolution? Devolution should make local government more simple rather than more complex. I think hopefully everyone can agree that, you know, a simpler, easier to understand system would be beneficial for everyone. Second, I think that devolution should recognise the big cities and the county shires need quite different governing arrangements. In the big cities, we've got this question now of going deeper in terms of devolution. We've already seen kind of the Trailblazer deals. There's been bits of pushback from Treasury and other Whitehall departments, in terms of giving more, you know, resistance to giving mayors a bit more freedom in terms of their funding. But really in kind of counties, I think the question is a bit more about, you know, the nature of their local economies, how they are organized, both as authorities, but also just the actual physical landscape, spatially, how they function and work. It's not obvious to me that sort of the combined authority kind of metro mayor structure is appropriate for economies of that scale and that nature. I think third, devolution needs to be economy first. You know, we know it's the government's number one mission. We know they're very anxious about making sure that economic growth is felt everywhere in every part of the country. That really means taking kind of economic geography and economic incentives and trying to put those at the center of the devolution debate. You know, if we're serious about kind of improving outcomes and in the economy, rather than just thinking about, you know, what is a deal that can be brought together, you know, who are the kind of willing partners who want to partner up in a devolution arrangement. Actually, if that creates an authority which is quite misaligned from the local economy, or which would really struggle to govern the structure of a local economy, then it's maybe not such a good idea to agree a deal of that kind. But I think also, we haven't kind of touched on this yet so far, is really thinking about how devolution can help solve the finance question. in local government. You know, really, we do know that there's this huge black hole in local authority and local government funding, and that there's really three choices facing the government. They can either have massive increases to everyone's council tax bills, which is the least popular tax in the country. They can have massive increases to central government grant, which, given their fiscal rules and the fact that it would reverse devolution, it would increase centralization. It's probably also not a desirable choice. Or they can think about reforming local finance and trying to sort out some advanced fiscal devolution for authorities across the country. Given we're also the most centralized country in the G7 fiscally, I mean, only about 5% of our tax take is collected at the local level. I think central government should really be considering kind of devolution structures and fiscal devolution as a way to kind of tackle this looming problem we're seeing in local authorities and local government. You know, these are kind of underlying principles. I think that there's lots of ways in that those could be interpreted and implemented. We've applied those principles to a map in a report we recently published called Devolution Solution, trying to simplify local government, advanced fiscal devolution, but really thinking about how we can, again, it has a fundamental framework that can form the basis for, you know, a sustainable devolution settlement that tackles a lot of the problems we've been discussing in this conversation. I think is the really key thing for the government at this stage.
Great, very good. Claire, come in. What would you be saying to, what should we be encouraging the government and the civil servants responsible for it to think about how they think about devolution? We've had loads of questions on, you know, should they think about devolution in the context of delivering national government's priorities, however defined, or are they autonomous agents, you know, free to pursue their own agendas and own issues? I mean, that's one of the issues that's come up through several of the questions, but just your thought on, you know, what would you be saying to government about how they roll this out?
Yeah, so it will not surprise you to know that I think it should very much be a blend of those two things, right? So one of the, you know, when I was at West Midlands Combined Authority, my role was as the sort of lead for inclusive growth and as kind of one of the kind of co-architects of our inclusive growth framework. And when it comes to thinking about, like, as you know, WMCA and the other authorities will be now, how do we mesh those things that are emblematic of our priorities as a region with these kind of 5 missions and other kind of targets that the government kind of brings through? And that is kind of very much possible, right? But I think there is that kind of, I will always come back to, and for Future Governance Forum, I will soon be doing a sort of second devolution report on this to kind of outline this model, sort of octopus model of devolution, which is all about that. How do you have enough intelligence in your kind of devolutionary bodies so that they can actually kind of respond and kind of work with the kind of assets of kind of places and economy? And I think government really needs to ensure that they are supporting the sort of the healing of local government. I am more agnostic to reorganization than I think Ant is, just because I know from the inside, even when you restructure very lightly, it uses a huge amount of kind of capacity and it stresses people out quite a lot. And it's like, and it's not to say we shouldn't do it, because there will also be some places that absolutely benefit from reorganizations for all sorts of reasons. But I think we have to be really clear about, what are you buying with that reorganization, right? Like, what are you going to be able to do that you couldn't do even in a messy and imperfect way with a load of smaller things? And for some places, there will be a really clear answer to that. And in some places, it will be a little bit more kind of complex to resolve. So I definitely say one thing I expect from government is that you have to allow these organisations, just as West Midlands and GM are being allowed to be, you have to allow them to become these kind of strategic leadership bodies, and you have to do the things that will allow local government to heal so it can play its full part in that. I know I've said that in very short sentences, but that requires a huge amount of money, politics, and attention. But nonetheless, I think it's really important that that sub-regional tier has that kind of participation of the local tier. And so I feel that there is no other kind of choice with that. The other bit I really wanted to talk about is accountability. And I think those of us who are sort of in dialogue with various bits of the Labour Party ahead of the election will know that the accountability of devolution is something that they were both exercised then about and continue to be exercised now about. And for me, there's always been this, so I was the deputy chair of the West Midlands Overview and Scrutiny Committee for the WMCA when I was an elected member. And, bloody loved it. I thought it was really important. We did some really good work considering that we were quite under-resourced at the time. But one thing I've always found really strange is that on the one hand, I would love the mayors to stay focused on those really big outcomes like health inequalities and driving their organisations to be really robust in how we respond to that. But if you look at the actual money and power that a CA has, it is an absurdity to hold the mayor accountable solely for that. Like the whole world of welfare benefits, the whole world of housing pretty much sits without the combined authority space. So to me, there is this kind of real missing thing. And our friends at Centre for Governance and Scrutiny will be delighted with me, because I think regional public accounts committees have a real kind of thing to add here. Because what I think we're really bad at doing is holding a system of not only public services, but public investments to account on how they achieve not only the missions of government, but a load of other things that we consider public services to be for. So if we're thinking about the space for public service reform, it strikes me that it is from things like regional pacts or other similar arrangements that would say, we are making all these separate investments across public services, and they are all shooting past each other in a way which is not serving our people. So if you've actually got something looking at system accountability, inclusive of the mayors, but not solely about them, I think we're in a much better position to be much more muscular on some of the changes that then need to be made in how we organise public services, not only at the sub-regional tier, but below that too.
Very good. And your sense, Claire, is that if some of those issues are not dealt with, whether it's that approach or a different, if the accountability scrutiny sort of aspects are not dealt with, that will ultimately inhibit and hold back the kind of bigger agenda, because of these concerns about, who's responsible for what and to what extent they can be held accountable. It's just a bigger question about, we need to resolve it. How we resolve it, there are different options, but actually resolving it is quite important for the strategic agenda that we're trying to talk about.
Yeah, and I won't bang on because I know we've got questions as well, but I do think we've got a really odd attitude to accountability in this country. Like, I see accountability and learning being two sides of the same coin. Like, there is, when I read an internal audit report that has been done well on various bits of public services or the NAO's work, you learn so much about, whether you did something wrong on purpose. You don't do something wrong on purpose, but things happen that through doing that you need to learn from, right? And we as a system put so much more money into the sort of executive, political, getting things done side, and comparatively little of the kind of engine into the learning from what we've done so that we can be better on that side. And I think because people are scared of it, because nobody wants to hear that something hasn't gone quite the way that we need it to. But I think we need to strengthen this system so we can kind of detoxify the idea of being held accountable, because it's like, I want to know if it's not going well. I want to be able to change it, because if I've got power to change it, why the hell wouldn't I do that? And so to me, I feel that this is all about, yes, it's about rebuilding trust in politics, but I hope in a way that we will all take a lot of pleasure and growth from.
Jack, come in on not on that, but just in your, what would we say? And we've had quite a few questions. It'd be interesting. We talked a little bit about to what extent that the incremental approach should continue, in a sense. Governments be thinking about laying out the sort of levels ones to whatever, but it's been sort of more ambivalent, say, on the geography question. I think, I'd be interested in, should government be more strategic around boundaries broadly defined, not just geographical, but boundaries of responsibility and things like that. I mean, what's your take on that? They should do more than they currently are, or not?
Yeah, I think on, boundaries is probably the most contested challenge around the devolution space. And I would agree with Claire that you just need to be kind of ruthlessly pragmatic in some sense, because the risk is that you just stall a lot of progress that you would otherwise make. I think one dimension of this question that we might build upon, drawing on the points Claire made around public service reform, is being really intentional about sub-state capacity. So yes, Greater Manchester and the West Mids have, 1,000 staff, give or take. But there are some combined authorities that have been there for the same period of time that have little more over 100 people in. And they're really quite small small combined authorities rather, and that gives you a limited ability to place shape. And to that effect, I think kind of public service reform provides a real fruitful avenue. So I would reflect on, for example, we are seeing organically some places developing kind of fostering partnerships at a sub-regional level, because it's really difficult to find people that want to be engaged in the fostering process. We are seeing some examples, and certainly we need more of this, but combined authorities thinking about how they operate in the children's and adults care market, because it's really difficult to find residential places, and actually that sub-regional level can be quite helpful. And a similar example, kind of more tangible one, in London, what we have at the moment is local authorities placing homeless households into accommodation in their neighbouring authority, and there's that kind of musical chairs of all of local authorities in London doing this through no fault of their own. The acute housing shortage, they have limited other options. But what we need is a kind of more strategic sub-regional or regional lens in that case to look at those issues. And so when I think about the policy domains that local authorities are responsible for, I think there's a bit more of a mature conversation needed around whether or not combined authorities are well placed, not to kind of play that full role and deliver a service, but to play some strategic function. And I think at the moment what we probably see is, it here, there and everywhere, a kind of performance dance of, mayors trying to not feel like they're stepping on their local authority colleagues' toes and vice versa, them feeling like power's being taken from them. So I think that's one observation.
Does that need to be codified, Jack, in a sense? And I use that word loosely rather than than specifically, but the sort of division of responsibility and or function, because we are where we are, and that might does that need to be codified over time, do you think?
I do think so. I wouldn't kind of expect to see this in, the framework we might see emerge in the English devolution bill or white paper. But I think the risk is, and the previous Conservative administration found this, you go through these frameworks quite quickly. And so if you don't have a kind of longer term vision of kind of how you might codify that and where you see different pieces of the institutional architecture sitting within a broader English governance framework, you kind of end up kind of running out of steam and not having enough direction.
Yeah.
Just the other point I'd make on local government reform, because I feel quite strongly about it. I mean, I think we should avoid and decouple local government reorganisation from devolution. Actually, I think it stalled some devolution deals because some places were concerned that it was a kind of local government reorganisation through the back door. But I think Ant makes a really good challenge. So no one would say that the current setup of 317 local authorities split across 164 districts, 33 or 32 London boroughs, 36 metropolitan districts and all the various other configurations is a sensible form of governance. But at the same time, I think the evidence is quite challenging to the idea of reform. So we see that the transitional costs are more expensive than we originally anticipate. You might say, okay, well, that's just a short-term challenge, but we see the financial benefits are often not as large as realised. And MHCLG in the noughties done quite a good study where actually it said, well, we recognise that local authorities deliver a whole range of services, and some of those are kind of really community-based. So if the kind of the unwritten rule around local government reorganisation, which is generally making them larger and unitaries, holds, then what we actually see is, well, some services might have a kind of better economies of scale, but other services will actually be worse off because, they really rely on kind of that community link. So I think the evidence for reorganisation is not as strong as advocates might otherwise suggest. And then I would just briefly reflect on, and I'm conscious of time, 2 points on kind of political capital. Norway's just undergone a period of reorganization. They reduced local authorities by 15% over the period of 7 years. So that's the kind of scale of change we might expect, and that doesn't feel to me proportionate to the political challenge. And in Australia, in New South Wales, they went through a process of what they called mergers, and now they are going through a process of demergers. They've said it doesn't work, and so they've gone through a very costly experiment of merging local authorities and now kind of trying to unpick that. So I just throw those in as kind of causes for concern.
Yeah, no, and obviously, we've had our own reasonably recent experiences in Scotland and Wales, and to a degree, Northern Ireland, in terms of some of the local government reform. And I mean, you speak for your, if you say we'll come back on this. I suppose one thought would be, Jack, essentially, the degree to which, or the worry is, you add extra layers, again, broadly defined, extra layers of things or institutions, public sector institutions, on top of existing layers, and then you get a real complex mismatch or mixture of different things going on. And there aren't the only reasons, but you can see where some of our combined authorities are not doing as well as others. That's not the only reason, but there is a factor in that, right? It was institutional complexity has gone up a notch, if not several notches, rather than actually come down notches because of the division of responsibility.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What I think that means is that you probably shouldn't have district councils being voting members of your combined authority, rather than reorganising those authorities themselves. And I think just one brief point before we move on, I'm sure there is this kind of idea that mayors are homogenous, and actually they've all got quite a significant variation of powers and responsibilities as well. So this idea that we create mayors and somehow the kind of landscape's much more understood by the public, I think is also challengeable.
Yeah. I'll bring Anthony. I mean, one question, I suppose, the sort of flip of it, again, just get your thoughts on it is, and we don't know, we'll have to wait and see, but just your reflections on whether we feel confident that government, and I'm talking primarily the officers rather than the politicians, because it's the officers that have to drive this agenda. There's enough capacity in the officer class to really, to move quickly and significantly on this agenda, which is, everywhere, all at once, all the rest of it. I'm interested in, what you've, not least because of what you were saying, Claire, that the individual comments and negotiations were painstaking, capacity intensive. Single settlements in 2 places has been, quite a dramatic experience for those parties involved. And if we were rolling that out en masse, there are constraints all over the place, or capacity constraints. So, and come start us off on that, I suppose. And if you want to, without going off, because we've only got 5 minutes, on the local government reform response to Jack, I'll give you leeway on that.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think on that kind of deeper versus wider kind of tension, I think the political imperative to go wider, to offer devolution to everywhere, is really understandable. I think it makes complete sense that the government is doing that. I think it's also really welcome that the government is saying that they want to go deeper, they want to go further in places that already have devolution deals. That's particularly important if you're thinking about devolution as a way to drive economic growth. I think it is possible that they could go both deeper and wider together across the country. However, I think that that would require them to be a bit more kind of forceful and consistent with the framework that they want, rather than the kind of current approach in which it's almost like deeper and wider are sort of happening in parallel, right? That you're having kind of widening is happening over there and then deepening is happening there. Really, we should be kind of thinking about how we can do deeper and wider in those places that don't have any devolution deals, as well as in the big cities. But that requires, a tougher approach that I'm not sure the government has. And if it's not prepared to do that, I think bandwidth questions become, as you mentioned with the teams, become a really important constraint. I mean, just going back briefly on what Jack said, I mean, I totally take the point about, like kind of community level, like truly capital L local level of representation and kind of service delivery. I think implicit within this is sort of a question about whether districts are kind of truly kind of local in this context. Districts are often very large in their shape and their form, I think if you think about how people often think about their community or their local area, it's often a much smaller and more intimate geography than some of those larger authorities. But I think certainly, if there was to be any kind of large reorganization, I hope it's kind of happening to some degree already in kind of the counties where this is happening, some sort of sub-county level of delivery, I think is an important priority. But the sort of looming thing for me that I think is different from the examples that from Norway and from New South Wales that Jack has raised is this finance question, right? If you're going to deliver kind of a finance solution for local government, which we know is in really a terrible position, I think you do need to be thinking about how do you do redistribution at the scale of the local economy? How do you do a system in which we have less national redistribution? We allow places to kind of grow their tax base, to collect the receipts from that, and spend it on public services. If we want those outcomes to be equitable and to be fair up and down the country, that means we do need authorities that have a mixture of different neighborhoods, some that are affluent, some that are less affluent, if we're going to have protect public services across the country, while also strengthening those economic incentives for places to grow.
Good.
That means you do need to go higher than local, and you do need to have these quite large single tier authorities that have a mixture of economic responsibilities and also service responsibilities too.
Great. Okay, got 2 minutes left. Claire, come in and get Jack's thought as well on this capacity constraint question. Claire, the ability of the system to do all that is laid out, or that we want to achieve, or will there be inevitable some prioritization, some choices that will need to be made? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there will have to be choices on that, So I think those of us who have ever kind of met the devolution team at MHCLG, who contain, really good, smart, hardworking human beings, but they have been working on a shoestring, like the same people who are responsible for the strategic thinking of how devolution is done and doing the deals and getting everything done are also the people doing all the grant agreements and that kind of work. So it's not tenable to suggest that really tiny group of human beings can be the only people who are concerned with making this work. So there is simply a question to ask about how resources can be distributed in order to make sure that this is a priority. So I think central government can look at that within itself, given that they will be doing a level of rewiring around missions anyway, and they've got some really good people thinking about that. I think this is another kind of place where there could be a real bonus there. And one thing I'll also say is that I think the arm's length bodies of government are also a real prize here, many of which were created in an era before we had a lot of mayoral combined authorities, and therefore now have, if not a purpose that is now in question, a purpose that absolutely has to adapt itself to a new environment in which it works. And so I think there is a real opportunity, actually. Yeah. So having worked in an MCA, we were really good at using secondments from local and national and from stakeholders to adapt ourselves to develop the organisation to do cool bits of work. I think we have got a real opportunity with the really smart use of secondments and the different links that exist between them to move this system along without necessarily, in the first instance, I think we will have to invest to move things along at some point, but the terrifying spending review can come first and we can get that out of the way before we perhaps move into that phase. Yeah. But I think a redistribution of those resources around the system in a really intentional and thoughtful way could be a really helpful thing.
Brilliant. Jack, give you sadly 30 seconds or so, but just your thought on the capacity constraint question, the system's ability to do.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I'm relaxed about civil service capacity. I think there are at some point programs that will come to an end, and there'll be opportunity for other civil servants to work in that space. Plus, while MHCLG leads it, as we see devolution deepen, we should expect other departments to play a bit more of a capacity role there as well. I would just quickly make the point that, and I'm glad Claire mentioned missions, which I think was the first time, kind of 59 minutes in. There's a interesting question about prioritization, which is, if your mission is growth, then, do you prioritize, say, an area in the southeast that might have higher growth potential than a part of the north? And that's very different to a mission that might have been under the previous government around region inequalities, and you might have thought of that in the reverse with prioritising places in the north. So I think there's an interesting prioritisation question there as well.
Yes, very good. We could definitely go on, but sadly we can't. Maybe we'll reconvene when we get the white paper, which undoubtedly will have all the answers to all the questions and the issues that has been raised by my brilliant panel, and indeed all the great questions that were on from the audience as well. We got through some of them around different ways, but yeah, we'll see. Maybe we'll reconvene when we get the white paper and that. But for now, thank you to Claire, Jack, and thank you all for joining. Next week it'll be labour market inactivity. So until then, take care.